Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to our event this morning, sponsored by the McKenna Center for Global Development and Human Development and Global Business. Pardon me, here at the Keough School of Global Affairs. I'm Ray Offenheiser. I'm the Center Director here at Notre Dame and of the Center, and I'm delighted that you could all make it this morning. The World Trade Center, the World Trade Organization, I should say, and the rules-based order that came with it, wants to find globalization. The World Trade Organization rules-based order that wants to find globalization is rapidly giving way to geopolitical pressures, climate change, and national security considerations. The U.S.-China power struggle, product shortages, and supply chain fragmentation associated with the COVID-19 pandemic have triggered a massive rethinking of global supply chains and strategic vulnerability. Growing competition for access to critical minerals prompts a gold rush to find secure control of these vital raw materials with potentially profound environmental impacts. The opportunity horizon for people experiencing poverty is now shaped by how private funds, rather than aid, are invested across Africa and Asia. Business and governmental leaders struggle to keep up and search for the right strategies and policies. It's a fast-changing global context for business. To provide deeper insight into these emerging trends and new policy initiatives, I'm delighted to welcome to Notre Dame my classmate of yesteryear and good friend, Dr. Gary Gereffi. Dr. Gereffi is a 1970 graduate of the university who went on to obtain his PhD in sociology at Yale. And after completing his doctorate, which focused on the Mexican pharmaceutical industry, he spent 3 years at the Harvard Business School working with the distinguished economist and Mexicanist Raymond Vernon as part of his team that was doing pioneering research on multinational corporations. Dr. Gereffi then went on to Duke University, where he is now an emeritus professor. And during his years at Duke, he became distinguished for his work on creating a framework for the analysis of global industries and individual companies, in effect, creating a whole new subfield in sociology. He has produced a rich body of published research on global business, and with support from the Rockefeller Foundation, he created the Global Value Chain Initiative at Duke University that allowed him to support the creation of a global network of scholars doing research on global value chains. The COVID-19 pandemic brought to the attention of governments and publics across the world how globalization has, on the one hand, brought us closer together and more interdependent, yet on the other hand, had built that interdependence on the basis of a very complex web of fragile global supply chains that, when tested during COVID, revealed all variety of strategic vulnerabilities that we're still dealing with today. In today's event, Dr. Gereffi is going to take us inside this complex and somewhat murky world of global trade, global corporations, and their supply chains, and will try to illustrate for us how the Biden-era industrial policy is seeking to address these vulnerabilities and build a more secure and more equitable national economy. He will elaborate on how government and the private sector are now in close communication on a set of strategic priorities that are at the heart of the CHIPS Act and other related legislation, and how a new availability of government funds and subsidies are driving rapid and strategic change at both home and abroad. We're going to organize this basically as more of a conversation between the two of us. He's going to open with some initial remarks to kind of frame the conversation, and then he and I will have a bit of an exchange for probably 45 minutes to an hour, and then we're going to open it up for questions to all of you. And this is being recorded, so I hope, if you do have a question, we're going to have a mic in the room so that just wait a second until someone can hand you the mic so that your question can actually be heard. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Gary, who will open with some initial comments.
Great. Well, thank you very much for the introduction, Ray. It's a really great pleasure to be back at Notre Dame for many reasons, but I think the kinds of topics we're discussing are very important in terms of both education, but also action. And we can talk about different ways universities can play a role in that. Ray, you and I have been fortunate to have very long and interesting careers and go in different directions. And since I've spent a lot of years teaching at Duke and in other universities, I know one of the things I enjoy is talking to the undergrads and grad students as they're thinking about what they want to do when they graduate. And usually the pathways after they graduate are not a linear pathway. They take different directions. And so maybe as a backdrop to our conversation, this has made me think of a couple events when I was an undergrad here at Notre Dame that shaped my career in ways that I wouldn't have anticipated. And I'm just going to mention two of them as a backdrop, and then we can pick up on them. One, I was a sociology major here at Notre Dame, but I didn't decide probably till the very end of my sophomore year what I was going to major in. When you come to a good university, you're so excited to see all these interesting courses. There's some requirements and on a lot of electives, but I like sociology because I thought it provided a pretty broad perspective on a lot of key questions. But what I didn't expect was that in my junior year, the chairman of the sociology department here at Notre Dame, a person named Bill D'Antonio, came with a really interesting proposal. He said, a recent Notre Dame grad who was from a small town in Texas outside of El Paso, Fabens, Texas, came back to Notre Dame and asked if the university could organize a community study on Fabens because, in this person's words, the town was dying. It's about 30 miles outside of El Paso. It was in the Cotton Belt, but cotton had actually moved away in terms of a key industry. An interstate had been built. A lot of the businesses in that town left, and they were really struggling to try to figure out how could this town survive in the midst of all the changes that were happening at the time. And so Bill D'Antonio and Notre Dame came up with a pot of money in a couple of months and said, yes, we'll create a group of people to spend the summer studying this town and try to figure out, analyze what the challenges have been, what the opportunities are, and provide a set of recommendations. But what was really special was that Bill D'Antonio and Erwin Press, who was the chairman of anthropology at the time, those two chairs organized a team of 2 undergraduates and 6 graduate students. So I was one of 2 undergraduates, and another one was a student named Tim McCary from anthropology. The graduate students include some people from sociology. One of them was a woman named Saskia Sassen, who later became a very famous urban sociologist and did work on global cities. We had a demographer, we had an economist, we had 2 Spanish women, all grad students in psychology, and each of us was assigned to a different topic in doing our community study. I actually had the community power structure, but because this was an unincorporated town, that wasn't an easy question, who held the power. But what was interesting and important about Fabens was that it was about 70% Mexican-American, 30% Anglo. And so the power dynamics were very different. The workers were largely recent migrants from the border. And so the question was, how do you create a set of economic opportunities for everybody? And the first 2 weeks that we went there, we all did a survey of this town. So we got to know people. Much of the work was done in Spanish. So that was another sort of nice opportunity because I had taken a lot of Spanish courses here at Notre Dame. But at the end, that experience did 2 things for me. One, it helped me understand that sociology was actually a discipline that could identify problems and actually help provide recommendations to solve problems. And when I was studying all these courses at Notre Dame, and I was thinking later what I would like to do, it was great to have this sense that this term, knowledge in the service of society, we always use it, but I had a chance to see what that meant in practice. And the other great thing about that was, as an undergrad, I had a chance to experience research. And I think this is a continuing challenge. I know at Notre Dame and at Duke, there's a big emphasis on getting undergrads more involved in the research tradition. And I had a chance to do this really early on. So that was step one. It convinced me that sociology was something that I would like to continue to study somehow, if I could do it. And the other experience at Notre Dame that was really pretty formative involved my Notre Dame roommate, John Rudolph, who happens to be sitting here in the auditorium because he's part of the ILI program. for this year at Notre Dame. But John and I, he was also a social major, did other political international relations things, but we both wanted to go to grad school in sociology. We applied, we got into 2 schools. I got into Yale, he got into Columbia, and we accepted those fellowship offers, but we were very fortunate that we had high draft numbers. And as we recall, the late 60s, the Vietnam War was a tremendous burden that everybody had to confront. I mean, how are you going to deal with that? And how does it shape your life when you graduate college? So we had this opportunity or flexibility to be able to not worry about being drafted. So we decided to take a year and hitchhike around the world before we entered graduate school. And in the 60s, hitchhiking was much more common than it was than it is today. But in doing that, so John lived in Spokane, and I'm telling you this because there's implications for what I do now, but I'll get to that in a second. John lived in Spokane, Washington. I was from Fort Lauderdale, Florida. Our plan was we were going to meet in Brownsville, Texas. So we had to somehow hitchhike from these 2 corners of the country to Brownsville. We spent a couple months in Mexico and Central America. We had some friends and contacts, but the idea of getting from place to place, hitchhiking was an adventure in and of itself. We had done a fair amount of that as we were interviewing for grad schools. But the big adventure was after Thanksgiving, we were going to fly to Europe. We took Icelandic Airlines, went to Zurich. And the reason we went to Zurich was because at Notre Dame, my sophomore capstone course professor, Tom Kapuscinskis, was studying at the Jungian Institute in Zurich. So he invited, and Jung was a very popular author at the time. We enjoyed meeting Tom. And then he said, pre-Christmas, go to the youth hostel in Zurich. And in the youth hostel, we quickly got an opportunity to work in a chocolate factory, the Linton Sprungli Chocolate Factory, because they had their pre-Christmas rush orders. So just like the Lucille Ball episode, if anybody remembers that, where she's stuffing chocolates in a conveyor belt, well, that was what John and I did. And then we went on to Spain and did other things. But the highlight of our trip was we were going to spend time in Africa. We crossed over in southern Spain to Morocco. We spent about 6 weeks in Morocco. And what we decided as we were looking at our Michelin maps was we were actually going to try to hitchhike across the Sahara Desert because we wanted to see sub-Saharan Africa. And we figured this might be an opportunity to do that. And in those days, there were people we could meet and talk with who were doing crazy stuff like this. The trouble was you couldn't get into Algeria at that time easily because the US didn't have commercial relations with Algeria. The Black Panthers were notoriously holed up there. So we met somebody whose husband worked in the Algerian embassy in Morocco. We got a visa, and we basically went from Algiers, which is our headquarters spot, and we traveled about 900 miles south to Niger, the capital of Niger called Niamey. And during that, and there's lots of adventures, and truckers would take people from oasis town to oasis town. So it was about 6 oasis towns. And we get to Niamey, and John decided he wanted to see East Africa. So he went on to Kenya and Tanzania, and I wanted to go to West Africa. So I went with this trucker that we were driving with and ended up in Lagos, Nigeria. So I got to Lagos and said, I really want to work for a while. So I went to the University of Lagos, sociology department, talked to the chair who knew Bill D'Antonio from Notre Dame. So I said, I'm willing to do some work, and he made some calls. And one of the calls was that I could teach in a high school in Lagos. And it was an Igbo high school. And at that time, there was a big war, but it was a chance to teach for 6 weeks because some Catholic priests were going back to Ireland for their holidays. And I taught religion, English literature, English grammar. And then I was asked if I could help coach the high school basketball team. This was pre-due, but this was a kind of a Coach K moment for me. And then afterwards, we came back. Actually, John and I met in Zurich totally by chance because I didn't know exactly what he was doing in East Africa, and he didn't know what I was doing in West Africa. And we started our graduate careers. Now, as I think back on that experience, of taking a year hitchhiking with all the adventures and the risks and uncertainties, and I think how it shaped my career going forward. I realized that a hitchhiker's view of the world is totally different than, say, a CEO's view of the world. But you learn very important things. And one of the things I took away from that experience was, I was very interested in development. International development, what it meant, and how you would experience it. But one thing I saw from the hitchhiker's point of view is this notion of uneven development. And Ray's work with Oxfam and other organizations, and in Bangladesh and in Peru, when you spend any time in developing countries, of course, we notice big gaps between global north and global south, but you also see those differences inside countries. And this question of winners and losers, and who's plugged in and who's not, I really had a strong appreciation of that from this year hitchhiking. And the other thing, and with this I'm going to conclude, when you're hitchhiking, you spend a lot of time talking to people you don't know. And it could be for hours, or it could be for days. And I realized later that what I took away from that experience was a really strong appreciation of the importance of storytelling and narratives. When I would meet these people and you'd talk with one another about what you've been doing, where you're going, and pretty soon people might tell you really personal details about their lives that other people don't know about. So you end up having to figure out, what can you learn about the world and about people in these encounters? So later, when I was doing my PhD work and started to do a lot more research on global industries, when I would go to new countries like Korea or Taiwan, later China, but initially also Mexico, I realized that to do the research I wanted to do, I had to talk to corporations. And the corporations were often big multinationals. And there was a question of, how are you going to get access to these companies? But for me, the interviews with the managers and also with the workers were incredibly informative. But to get access, I had to use some of the skills and networking techniques you use when you're hitchhiking and you have to be able to get into a company. But once you talk to a company and you tell them the kind of research you're planning to do, and if they feel convinced that you've got good methods and it's important questions, they will open all kinds of doors for you with other companies. So when you're doing this corporate research, you do a kind of corporate hitchhiking. You go from company to company, and they help you understand how these so-called supply chains work. But you also appreciate the fact that the managers, they knew a lot that I wanted to learn, but as we were talking about globalization issues, there was a lot of things I was researching that they didn't know about. So they would ask if I could be sure to give them the results of the research, because here's what they knew. I could talk with these other companies, but here were the problems they were facing and real uncertainties. And I think that continues to the present day. So as a sociologist who was looking at how industries are organized and how firms set up global supply chains and global production networks, I found this kind of hitchhiker's view of the world, the bottom-up view, was not only important because you understood something about development, but it was also important because you understood that every actor in that chain, including these big companies, are all struggling to kind of make sense of where they are and what their opportunities are. So for me, the interview technique became the pillar of a lot of the qualitative work I did on these global industries later. And it was the way I developed insights into how industries were changing from the viewpoint of the company managers themselves. So let me stop there.
Well, maybe I think a nice segue maybe from that part of the conversation, that story. So you end your hitchhiking and you end up back, you get this degree at Yale in sociology. And then I'm going to jump ahead a little bit. You end up I'm sort of jealous of this experience to some degree, working with this scholar, Raymond Vernon at Harvard, who's someone I was familiar with as well, who, was actually really a pioneer researcher in working on multinational corporations at a time when that was a new word in our collective global vocabulary. And that really sort of set you up and created a path to Duke University. And at a time when Duke was actually having somewhat of a interesting process of rethinking how they wanted to approach, the way business was represented within the university and how they wanted students to experience it. I thought it might be an interesting maybe approach to going further into this, to maybe talk a little bit about what Duke was up to, and then how you fit into that, and then how it opened up this broader field that you actually began to create from a Duke platform.
Sure, perfect. But the Harvard piece, just to say something more about that, Ray Vernon was a well-known professor in the Harvard Business School, but he had this multinational enterprise research project that was probably the first of its kind, started around 67, lasted through the late 70s, where he was trying to track how US and European and Japanese multinationals began to set up international production networks and sales networks. And so when he invited me, he knew about the work I was going to do in Mexico, and Ray had also written a very excellent book on Mexico called The Dilemma of Mexico's Development. So he was interested in both multinationals and Mexico. That was my topic. So he invited me to spend a year to work on that. But what he also told me when I got there is he was teaching these courses in international business to Harvard Business School students who were incredibly smart and all of that. But he said very few people were doing the kind of in the field research on multinationals that I had just been doing in Mexico. So he wanted me to come in to his Harvard Business School class and talk about how you would actually research multinationals. And that was kind of ahead of its time, because he was doing a lot of very important tracking, empirically documenting how and why US and European and Japanese corporations grew. But this idea that researching them and how they relate to governments and how multinationals are connected to development, that for him was something very important that business schools had to start to do. So I was able to do that with him. When I went to Duke in 1980, I think that experience at the business school was important, because Duke, I was again in sociology, so I was hired by the sociology department at Duke, but it's kind of like Notre Dame. It was a broad department in the sense that it was dealing with lots of issues. And sociology at Duke had people working on firms and working on networks and industries. So when I was hired, it was partly also because Duke was going global, but they also wanted to figure out how to deal with international, with business. And in the 1970s, Duke had a very popular business administration major in the 50s and 60s. And then around 1970, they stopped it. And they said, business schools are growing, MBA programs are growing. We don't think an undergraduate university needs to have an undergraduate business major, because businesses want to hire people with diverse skills. So for a decade, they did away with the business major. But in the early 80s, just when I was hired, they started to rethink that. And they began to say, there's got to be a way that we can create a social science, broader approach to business education that will help give people interested in business and global economy more impetus. And so we created a program organized by sociology that was an undergraduate certificate program. So it wasn't to compete with majors. A certificate program, you had to take 7 courses. 3 of them were core courses. Those were newly created, and 4 were from traditional courses in the curriculum. And then you did a capstone seminar. And the tension there was economics was the biggest major at Duke. And the economists were saying, well, why is it that sociology is the department that would be setting up some kind of interdisciplinary program called markets and management studies, which sounded like it should be more economics oriented. And we had very productive and conversations back and forth about why that is. And one of the things the economists were saying is, since a lot of Duke students, like Notre Dame students, go into consulting and business, shouldn't they have at least some required business courses like micro, macro, and something else? And otherwise, they would never be hired by the top consultants. And we did then a little study of Goldman Sachs, which is one of the companies that regularly came to Duke to recruit. And we said, who are the 10 most recent Duke students that they have hired the last couple of years? And it turned out that 4 of them were majoring in econ. 2 of them were comparative area studies. 2 of them were philosophy majors, and 2 were other kinds of majors. And when we talked to the Goldman Sachs people about what our discussion with social and econ was, they said, sure, people who have an economics background, they're fine. But what we really want are people who can think outside the box, who can write well, who can speak well, and they love philosophers in particular because they said they had a clarity of thinking, and comparative area studies students because they had a broader comparative perspective. So this Duke experience at the undergraduate level was to say, let's rebuild undergraduate business education in a way that would use the complementary knowledge bases that departments provide, and that would be a better entry point into the business schools. Turns out Stanford and Northwestern in particular, and a number of other private research universities that had discontinued undergraduate business majors began to follow this kind of a model, create something interdisciplinary as a way to move into business. So that was one part of the Duke experience that I think was really useful. And then this certificate program became the most popular program. Initially, women's studies was by far the biggest certificate program. Then this came along, and 1 in every 6 Duke undergrads was getting their certificate in markets and management studies. Then in the last 5 years now, there's been more of a connection between the business school at Duke, which is called Fuqua, and undergraduates. They have a 5-year BA/MA degree. They've also got a master's program in innovation and entrepreneurship. So now there's new directions that are exciting. But back then, business school was teaching grad students, MBAs particularly, and the undergrad curriculum had to figure out how do you do this. And I think Duke came up with a really nice model. The other thing that Duke did was building on this work on global supply chains that I had started to do at Harvard. The Rockefeller Foundation was saying, when they looked at how people were trying to understand international business and society, there were different fields that weren't speaking to one another. There was one group of people that were looking at global industries, another group that would be looking at local clusters like Silicon Valley or Route 128 in Boston, and Europe was full of those kinds of interesting clusters. And then other people looking at national industrial policies like Japan or Germany or whatever, but nobody was bringing those levels together. So Rockefeller created a 5-year initiative that they called the Global Value Chains Initiative to try to bring together researchers from different disciplines, sociology, economics, economic geography, political science, et cetera, to create a unified theory of how do you link global economy, national and local levels of analysis. And we did that over 5 years. We started with a network, I guess, of 15 or 18 core people, and then we gradually helped create a pretty broad international network of researchers. And at the end, I was at Duke, had finished being director of this Markets and Management Studies program, and Rockefeller Foundation said something really smart that I wouldn't have anticipated, which was, your group has helped launch a new framework, created a network of scholars, great. But how do we institutionalize that going forward? If we were to stop your grant today, things could just kind of dissipate. And they asked if one of our universities, the 3 organizers of this was a person from MIT, Tim Sturgeon, John Humphrey from Institute of Development Studies at Sussex in the UK, and myself at Duke. So I said I could create a center at Duke called the Global Value Chain Center. I mean, it's what it's called today. It had a slightly different name earlier. And now I realize what a smart move that was, because it allowed us at Duke to be able to hire a set of researchers that were doing this new kind of research on supply chains in different parts of the world and competitiveness, and allowed us to work with clients, not the traditional business clients like a consulting firm would do, but clients like Ray's organization, Oxfam America, that were looking at issues like international inequality, food industries, and the big one we started with was something called the Environmental Defense Fund, looking at projects like clean technology and US jobs. And what was happening with these different groups that were trying to understand how business and society connect and how you do that with changing technology and new industry priorities was that they realized universities are the place you would go when you want to try to understand things in a new way. If they can develop the tools and the methods, and then they publish the result for the public domain, which is what we had to do as a university research center, then you could help spark fields to develop much more fully. And especially in the environmental, this clean technology US jobs was such a neat project because This occurred in 2007-8, right during the Obama campaign, just before he was elected. And one of the hot topics in the campaign was how many jobs are in the green economy, and how do you link manufacturing and clean technology? So AFL-CIO was on board with this, different environmental groups, and they called it the Blue-Green Alliance. But they wanted evidence. They didn't really know how many jobs there were. So what EDF asked us to do is take 5 different products. One was LED lighting, for example, and do 3 things. Each product do a value chain map of what goes into an LED light. What raw materials do you need? What key components do you have to create? What's the final product? How is it distributed to buyers? So that was one thing. And that's where the value chain, thinking of industries as a supply chain, but not just the what, but the who and the where. And then the second question was, okay, in the US, which factories are making key components of these products? We did solar panels was one, LED lights was another. And then the third was how many jobs those factories create. So it was a great research project that wasn't easy because when you're doing this supply chain work, there are no data sets. There's great data on trade, and trade kind of can get pretty detailed, but the trade statistics in the US and the production statistics use different categories. And company activities are different categories. So you need to figure out what they are. But in the end, the companies were the most important groups. And final example, when we had to do the jobs, I remember some company was making engines like Cummins Motors, was doing some new sort of electric vehicles, but the more traditional industries were most of what they did. And they said, well, how are we going to calculate the number of jobs? Let's say we've got 1,000 people in our plant. Maybe 80% of our activities is traditional stuff, 20% are new technology. So maybe let's call it 200. So just coming up with things like job estimates in a smart way just required a lot of thinking and a lot of research, but it was the kind of thing that researchers liked to do because they felt that work could make a difference. And in the end, those studies were what EDF did. It was very smart. Is they were looking at us as a research institute, but they really had policy goals. They wanted to take this research and disseminate it to states that had these factories to say, see, there is a commonality between manufacturing production in the US and clean technology. And we're going to show you what it is, and then let's build it out. And they think initially 2,000 copies of our report went to staffers in Congress that they had connections with. And we ended up doing 23 different products over 3 years. So that's the kind of model that would never have occurred if we weren't in a university research center, but it helped us develop a research capability at Duke that I think is now what we're starting to see other universities begin to do as demand is picking up on these topics.
So now we're going to jump, I think, from Duke maybe into the kind of bigger problems that the sort of more kind of changing global macro economy. Maybe I could put it that way. And maybe the good point of departure for that is really the COVID experience and what happened with COVID to all of these presuppositions about globalization, what was good and bad about globalization, and what we learned about how fragile perhaps the whole globalization experience had made us as a nation and perhaps even as a world. Or maybe we can sort of go into that.
I mean, fortunately for most of us, COVID is kind of in the rearview mirror to a large degree, but not completely. But when COVID hit in around March of 2020, when it first became perceived to be a serious problem that was going to affect the US, all kinds of emergency measures were taking place. But I think what made COVID so transformative in terms of how it affected the global economy was that it was a virus that first moved incredibly fast. So it basically circled the world within about 6 months. It affected all countries, all industries, but the really key thing was it affected both supply and demand simultaneously. Usually when companies are preparing for disasters, they're thinking of natural resource disasters, an earthquake, a hurricane, whatever. The damage is localized. They try to figure out how the rest of their supply chain or how the rest of the industry can deal with a particular place. Then they try to have relief efforts to get that place back online. But COVID affected everything. COVID affected all these industries where workers couldn't go to factories because they had to stay home. We didn't know exactly how it was transmitted. There was a high level of mortality in those early months. And at the same time, the demand side was collapsing. No more airlines. Nobody's going to movie theaters. People wouldn't go shopping anymore. So when you think, we just have not had anything that I can think of in the last couple of centuries that approximated the impact. But what COVID did in the area that I work in was it made everybody start to think about supply chains, because everybody saw these product shortages. Why aren't there face masks? You know, where are the ventilators we need for the intensive care units in hospitals, because people are dying? We don't have enough of those. And it wasn't just these medical supply products, but all kinds of other industries got affected. You'd see these cover of Newsweek or different magazines, tomatoes and other fresh vegetables being plowed under the soil because there wasn't demand. Eggs and milk just being thrown out. Even though this issue like toilet paper shortages, everybody's saying. So I'd go to dinners and they kind of keep blaming me, you know, so why is this product in short supply now? And why is that product? And what's this got to do with supply chains? And I think it affected two things. One was this reality that industries are connected and product shortages come because you might have an upstream problem that is going to affect the downstream availability, but also made people think about globalization in a new way. Because a lot of the shortages that we were seeing was because product X wasn't made enough in the US. And now the kind of demand spikes that were occurring for something like face masks, if you think about, face masks was the only product of the medical supplies that was both in demand by health professionals and the ordinary population. Most things like the rubber gloves or the hospital gowns were used in hospitals, but the rest of us didn't have to worry about it. But face mask was a kind of classic example where demand spiked maybe 100-fold beyond what it was before. And then the question was, how do we scale up? How do we find supply? And then a lot of it was, well, the biggest import, US imports 90% of its face masks. Most of those imports come from China or other Asian countries. So all of a sudden, the supply chain shortages became a criticism to some degree of globalization. Well, or at least raising questions. Are we too vulnerable on outsourced supply? And then companies, US companies, would have to be brought to task and say, well, how do we fix this? And so I think that the supply chains became really important as a result of COVID. And it started to become, supply chains were really defined as national security in a way they never were before. So we knew about globalization in the abstract. We knew about trade. We knew different countries were important. But all of a sudden it came back to companies. Well, have you overextended yourself? Is this cost-based system that was considered a real advantage now a detriment because we're in this crisis? And I think in the research world, for me in particular, and a lot of my colleagues working on these issues, it was just this tremendous demand in academic journals and popular press. Help us do this analysis to figure out how to describe the current situation and what the particular solutions might be. So it really changed the nature of our thinking about the global economy. And I think it set the stage for what we are now seeing as kind of 21st century industrial policy. And I'll just say one word about maybe the Biden administration, how they began to approach it. When you're looking at supply chains and you're looking at shortages, and particularly, let's say the face mask was a good example because I worked on it a lot. It seems like a very simple product, except that the filters in face masks come from very high-tech process because it's using nanofibers to be able to block out the bacteria. Turns out that the vast majority of filters that were face masks that were used prior to COVID were for industrial use. People that were working in chemical environments or dusty environments. The medical use of face masks was relatively small, maybe 20% of the demand. And so when we started to say, how do we ramp up supplies of face masks or how do we ramp up supplies of ventilators, all of a sudden you realize it wasn't just a simple find companies that can begin to expand production. And so we began to get a very almost panic-driven attack of how can we get companies to make more of this? And if US companies can't do it, how do we change trade relations. So there was, for I'd say 12 months, a real searching for answers and looking for other countries that could help. So I think it's just made us realize we need to have a better handle on how supply chains work in the global economy and the US economy. And that set up, I think, in the Biden administration, a big set of new initiatives regarding to strengthening supply chains as a result of this crisis.
Yeah, I mean, maybe just a brief reflection, and maybe I think we want to kind of continue down that line a little bit. You know, for 40 years in Washington, D.C., this may seem sort of quite a radical statement. It wasn't appropriate to use the term industrial policy. And because basically the economics of this last 40 years have basically argued that basically that's picking winners, you're messing with the economy, you're messing with the markets. And so, you know, the government should stay out of business altogether, don't subsidize anything, don't pick winners, and don't make strategic decisions about how the market should operate. Well, the end result of that was you ended up in Washington where there were hardly ever any conversations about American competitiveness in a globalizing world. So we ended up with a market that was basically making all of its own decisions on cost and efficiency, but not on necessarily on strategic priorities for the United States. And by comparison, China has industrial policy. Germany has industrial policy. We had industrial policy from literally the 1940s to the 1980s. And then we abandoned it completely. And in effect, we had a government that didn't have a global strategy for how it wanted business to engage in the world in ways that represented American strategic interests. So then comes Biden, and all of a sudden he realizes we have weaknesses in defense, we have weaknesses in commodity acquisitions, we have weaknesses in basic chemicals for pharmaceuticals, and on and on and on. So now that I think the choice in Washington, it's now okay to talk about industrial policy because we're seen as being strategically weak. And in some quiet corners in Washington where these discussions are going on, there's discussions about how many decades are we behind China in this area? How many decades are we behind Germany in this area? In terms of a whole lot of industrial processing areas and a variety of other concerns that the government now has about these issues. So we are actually at a radical turning point on these particular questions. And this is where I think I'd like Gary to go next and sort of take us into like, what is the Biden administration pushing, why, and on what fronts, and what's really critical at this particular point strategically?
Right. And let me just pick up on your point about the history of industrial policy in the US, because US clearly has advanced as the strongest economic, technological, military power in many areas. And it's typically been this idea of free market of some sort. But when you look back, we've at least had three bouts or waves of industrial policy. We had an industrial policy in the 1930s when you were dealing with the Depression, and the government had to try to come in and figure out how do you rebuild industry through a collapse. We had another type of industrial policy in the 1980s when the concern was about Japan. Japan was a superpower in the 1980s with incredibly diverse exports, especially in automotive and electronics. All these articles about Japan Inc., how is anybody going to compete? Germany was also the biggest exporter from Europe. So in that era, there was a lot of concern coming from American manufacturers that our industries would be wiped out if we just let these export-oriented economies like Japan and Germany and later Korea come into the US market without any restrictions. So we had this term called managed trade that was around in the 80s. And the gist of it was that one tool was something called voluntary export restraints. So the US negotiated with Japan and automobiles an export restraint on the number of vehicles that they could send to the US, and similar things for Korea and Taiwan and Germany on products that they were big in. And then that was followed up with exchange rate adjustments. So basically make the yen and the Deutschmark more highly appreciated. So all imports coming from those countries would be more expensive in dollars. The response to that, which was very effective in stopping the imports, was a new wave of foreign investment from those countries into the United States in the very same industries. So in the automobile industry, we had a massive wave of Japanese, German, Korean, and other European investments, which actually from the automobile industry point of view was kind of a good thing. Now half of the cars produced in the US are from what are called foreign-based automobile companies, but that created new jobs, that brought in new skills, brought in new ways of organizing production systems. So the Toyota system, which was very much focused on lean production, higher quality, et cetera, actually replaced Fordism as the way to set up mass production lines. So there was lots of benefits in some ways that came from having FDI come in and focus on jobs, but it certainly wasn't a way that protected US firms. Now, when we get to Biden's kind of industrial policy, I would call it 21st century industrial policy that's driven more by supply chains. The concern wasn't with final products like cars, televisions, transistor radios, computers. How do you block them coming from the super exporters in different parts of the world? The concern now is with critical intermediate products in the supply chain. So when Biden issued something called the 100-day report in June 2021 around how his administration would try to deal with a new set of strategic industries for the US economy that had been damaged or weakened by the pandemic, but other issues. The 4 key industries: semiconductors, batteries for electric vehicles, active ingredients for pharmaceuticals, not the end product, the active ingredients, and critical and rare earth minerals. Every one of those strategic industries feeds in to many other industries, but it shows that in a supply chain world, in a supply chain form of industrial policy, the question was who controls those intermediate products is absolutely essential. So that was one important part. And the other, I think, is this realization, because part of what came out of the pandemic was one reaction is if globalization has gone too far, if we're too dependent on other countries sending us critical goods, well, let's just bring everything back to the US. Reshoring was kind of considered to be one response. But when people started to look at the way these industries like semiconductors and others were organized, over the last 50, 60 years, we've developed a kind of international specialization in these industries that no single country can match. If you look at semiconductors, which has gotten a lot of attention because it's so important for cutting edge technologies like quantum computing and artificial intelligence, but also for traditional ones like automobiles, the top company in the world in terms of creating the most advanced semiconductors is Taiwanese. TSMC, Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company. Others are close, but they define their progress by the number of nanometers, billions of a meter, that separate the transistors in a semiconductor device. Only one company in the world, based in Belgium, ASML, can make the photolithography equipment used to produce those semiconductor chips. And what's so fascinating, if you think cutting edge is these 3 nanometer chips, TSMC can make it. We're getting a wave of new investments coming in. Intel is close. Samsung is close. The 3 big companies are TSMC, Intel, Samsung. A nanometer, now that it's down to 3 nanometers and they're trying to push to 2, a nanometer is how much your fingernail grows in 1 minute. So imagine your fingernail in 3 minutes. That is the 3 nanometer width of the space in semiconductors, and they're trying to reduce it to 2 or 1. So when you think about how precise that manufacturing is and how capital intensive those plants are, it's not a surprise that you can't just snap your fingers and say, well, semiconductors are important or active ingredients in pharmaceuticals are important. Let's bring it all back to the US again. This globalization was somehow far-fetched. One other example, if you look at the coronavirus vaccines that were the real miracle of the pandemic, was that in 1 year, there were all these vaccines, 7 or 8 different versions out there. A company like AstraZeneca that was making one of those vaccines, they have 25 manufacturing partners in 16 different countries just to make this new vaccine. So I think the reality of 21st century globalization is certain countries are still going to be really strong, but they are not going to be self-sufficient. And a big part of Biden's, I think, industrial policy has to be, how do you create alliances with your partners, European and North American and Asian, if you're going to try to pursue these kinds of new industrial policies like the CHIPS Act or like the Inflation Reduction Act. And I think that's where universities are really positioned to play a key role. And just maybe an example or two about how policymakers are now showing much more flexibility. When they did the CHIPS Act, one of the tools in the CHIPS Act was really big subsidies that the U.S. government was going to provide to companies that were coming in, and there was a sense that all of this investment had to come in the U.S. And with electric vehicles, that had to be made in the U.S. Mexico, Canada come along and say, well, how could you say made in the U.S. if we have a North American free trade agreement? Shouldn't we have a North American clause, not a made in America? And the policymakers adjusted it. They said, so I think what's happening now is policymakers want to move fast. They're trying to do big bills, but they've got all these partners. And if sometimes they create the bill in a way that looks like it's walling off some of their partners, how do you adjust? So I think this is part of what's coming into focus.
Well, maybe, I mean, I think one thing I think we'd be remiss if we didn't talk a little bit about is, we have Xi Jinping in San Francisco right now, and Biden is trying to reframe the relationship with China. And there's some real reasons for that to go way beyond Taiwan that have to do with these supply chain questions. And I mean, one example is lithium, where the issue with lithium is we actually know where we can get it, but we just can't process it. And so if you can't process it, you can't actually use it. But there's a variety of other issues that have to do with the China relationship that you might want to elaborate on, that where we can't live with them, we can't live without them. It's sort of the
You're right. And I think China is a unique challenge for the U.S. It's different from Japan, much bigger, of course, many more industries, very high tech across a lot of different technology. So I think looking at the reporting on the discussion between Biden and Xi yesterday in San Francisco, it seems like the way they're trying to reframe that relationship is competitor versus adversary. I think this is very important from the U.S. vantage point. China is, I think, the only country that could probably challenge the U.S. across the economic and technological and military or geopolitical space. And I think part of what the global economy is all about is the U.S., even when it had some kinds of industrial policy, managed trade, it still believed that the international economy is the way things have to work out. And the U.S. wants to be in a really strong position to control directions of change and have partners and all of that. So I think in this relationship with China, the idea is they can be a competitor, but if we're going to do big global challenges like climate change or sustainability, we also need China as a partner. And I think that's a really critical direction of how this relationship is going to shift going forward. We know that China's one of the things that the Biden administration did that was following on some of the trade controls of the Trump administration is they really tried to cut China off from some of that most advanced semiconductor technology because they were concerned both about security abuses and how companies like Huawei, if they became really important, could create security risks. But they were also concerned about things like artificial intelligence, which I think is the most important kind of technology we're facing. So I think reframing that relationship in a positive way is very important. And I think part of what the Biden administration policies were doing in Inflation Reduction Act is to say, going forward, if we're going to rebuild these supply chains and industries, the U.S. still needs strategic partners. We still need to be working closely with Europe. We need to be working closely with Japan, Korea, Taiwan, as well as Mexico, Canada. So how do we set up a set of relationships where we've got partners we can rely on, but it doesn't appear like we're trying to isolate China completely? And so that, because China's got its own aspirations and it wants to become a geopolitical equal in some regards in terms of a great power. So I think that is important, and nobody has the technology China does. And just one example, when I was doing research in China about R&D centers, one of the criticisms of China was that they would tell every American multinational, you have to set up a local R&D center. So I went to Google and I went to IBM and I went to Microsoft, and interviewed them about the R&D centers they were setting up in China and said, is this a problem for you? And they said, well, we don't necessarily like the restriction, but one thing about being in China, we can get more engineers, computer scientists, and other highly skilled professionals that can work in our R&D center than we can find anywhere else in the world, and that they could tackle new problems in a way that was compatible with what they were doing in other parts of the world. And the one example I remember was, I guess it was Google, where they were doing translation, in simultaneous translation. They said, we can do that for Western languages, but when we get to Chinese characters, we don't have the technology that can recognize that. So they had to put in place 1,000-person team to figure out how would you create the translation software for Asian characters. And they had some medical examples, et cetera. So I think if we're trying to think about are we in a positive sum world or a zero sum world, China can be and has been in a number of cases a really important partner for big global challenges and even for some of the technology advances, even while they can be a very fierce but sort of in the rules of the game competitor in terms of a lot of the other issues we're trying to deal with strategic industries.
So maybe bringing the geopolitics question back home, what does all this mean for an Indiana, or North Carolina, and for Washington? In other words, how's the administration kind of organizing itself for this kind of work? And then you've done some work on North Carolina a little bit and thinking about, how does North Carolina position itself? And Indiana's doing a lot of that kind of thinking. What should we be doing differently and maybe with a little bit more haste?
I think what supply chains make us realize is there is this global economy with all these supply chains, but it's sort of like, think global but act local. These global supply chains are creating both opportunities and challenges for countries to move up. But inside the US, when I'm looking at the Inflation Reduction Act or the bilateral infrastructure bill for Biden, that money is going to be distributed all across the country. But every place it's distributed, the issues are implementation. We've got the money, it's been appropriated, but to work out those bills like the CHIPS Act that's focusing on semiconductors, or Inflation Reduction Act, which has a lot of clean energy, or infrastructure, they're trying to figure out when you spend that money, let's say to set up a new semiconductor plant, what's the local ecosystem going to look like? How are local companies going to be prepared to do that? So I think this is giving rise to a way to think about competitiveness. Like at Duke, we did something on North Carolina and the global economy. How do the different industries that North Carolina has focused on, like textiles or furniture or biotech or IT, how are they being challenged, and what are the opportunities for North Carolina? I think the same thing is true with Indiana. When we put up North Carolina in the global economy and did 7 industries and said we can look at firms, we can gather data, we could map out value chains and show where North Carolina is strong, but also where they're weak. Michigan, Pennsylvania, Massachusetts came and said, how can we do that here? Indiana would be another perfect example. So I think one role of universities is to help the places where they're located understand the complexities of these supply chains, and then find a way that you could be training students and doing the kind of research that would allow you to work together with companies to develop competitiveness strategies from the bottom up that complement those that are coming from the top down.
So maybe one, I'm just going to give you one more because I want to just follow up on the university one.
Okay.
It seems like we've got 2 problems simultaneously. On the one hand, we've got this competitiveness challenge, which is all embedded in the supply chains. The other one is we've got some ethical and maybe moral challenges around how do we do all of this in a world with climate change, reduced, limited resources, and where we have to think more about sustainability and some of the questions that come with that. And CEOs are trying to grapple with both at the same time and manage the costs and efficiencies that tension creates.
Right.
So I wonder if you could say just something like that to close, and
Sure.
we'll turn it over to the audience.
Right. So I think there was an example in Duke from a couple weeks ago that is pretty informative. They did a conference on the CHIPS Act, organized by the Fuqua School of Business, together with the law school, together with public policy. And they had a faculty member from the Fuqua School of Business who was the chief economist of the Secretary of Commerce, Gina Raimundo. But then in year 2, he was asked to set up the terms in which subsidies for semiconductor companies would be given. Like, what's the quid pro quo that's going to have to go on? And when they did this conference at Duke, they brought in a lot of the companies. But one day, they had Intel, they had IBM, they had a North Carolina-based company called Wolfspeed. It used to be called Cree. They brought in the National Science Foundation. It was getting a lot of the money. But what the legal people were saying was one of the big issues is permitting to create these big factories. And a lot of the permitting challenges have to do with land rights issues, for example. And so they're concerned about how do you recognize what those questions are? How do you facilitate those issues? When you were mentioning lithium earlier, one of the biggest sources of lithium, New Mexico has lithium. They decided to nationalize it. Canada has lithium, and they've got enormous hydroelectric reserves, but they're very concerned about indigenous tribal rights and vulnerable communities. So I think what a university does is it creates a space for multiple stakeholders in these industries that are being subject to negotiation to come together. So the legal people and the ethical focus on vulnerable communities, or labor focus on how do we create the right skills in the workforce, come together with the companies and the policymakers. And I find that that dialogue is really important. And when we had that meeting at Duke a couple of weeks ago, companies were excited about what was happening, but they were worried about the next 5 years. And how are we going to implement this? And who's going to help us figure out what these issues are? So I think that is the role that universities are uniquely positioned to play, actually, because you need a safe space for these multiple groups that are involved in these industries to get together, be able to discuss things, and have smart people around that can maybe go and do some research to answer some of the questions they're trying to grapple with.
Great. Well, Gary, thanks so much. And maybe what we'll do now is we're going to just open it up. We've got a microphone here. If anybody wants to kind of pose a question, most welcome. Anybody want to lead off?
Maybe they could introduce themselves.
And could you introduce yourself as you pose your question?
Can you hear? Yeah. Nahal Yunus. I was a really fascinating talk. What I'm not sure about in terms of when you talk about the supply chain and how that's moved, you use the term cost basis. I'm assuming companies go to whatever the cheapest source is. And now these other factors of reliability, and then also countries vying against each other, so strategic aspects. When you move away from the cost base, I'm assuming basically consumers ultimately have to pay more, because that's the ultimate impact of not going for the cheapest route every time, but factoring reliability. How does that then, what's your thoughts on that? That ultimately when you start building walls and providing grants and doing various rebates, that actually it's consumers who are going to end up footing a higher bill?
Yeah, well, that's a classic question. I would say that when we think about why companies move where they do, cost is one issue. You try to find ways of reducing costs, whether the workforce, transport cost, or whatever. Second issue is resources, where you can find the resources you need, so that in that supply chain, the raw material side of it becomes critical. So when you're doing lithium or cobalt, you might have to be in Africa, Australia, Canada. So that's another factor. But a third one is skills. And I think this idea of skills, especially for these high-tech industries, is important. Now, we know countries can create skills over some period of time, but what's happening with the fast-paced nature of globalization is that, for example, these semiconductor plants that are being cited in different states in the US they're trying to figure out how fast they can create the skills that are needed for those plants. And often they're behind the curve no matter how fast they want to move. So one thing that's happening on the skills development side, which I think is one of the biggest challenges and opportunities for us in the US, is they've said, for example, a semiconductor plant, 70% of those workers are going to need 2-year technical degrees, which you could get in community colleges. And we've got a really strong community college system in general, something similar to Germany. Then 20% are going to be master's students, and maybe 10% are going to be PhDs. So we've got to balance that mix. But there's one other factor that I think is really important, which is over time, the nature of manufacturing itself has changed dramatically. all factories today are much more automated than they were in the past. So there was an example. So two examples. North Carolina has a strong furniture industry. It closed down about 20 years ago, and production moved offshore to different countries, but it started to rebound about 10 years ago because there was some big demand, a lot of it coming from China and elsewhere, for the kind of high quality wood furniture that North Carolina was famous for. And they went back and said, so orders are picking up, let's go. And the factory manager said, when we closed our factories 10 years before or 15 years before, our management's been dispersed, our workforce is dispersed. We can't immediately come back and recreate that. But even more importantly, these factories now use different technologies. And I think the automation is a big part of what we need to think about in bringing back manufacturing to the US, all types, appliances, automotive, et cetera, is that the technologies that companies are using today, even in China, automation is so pervasive that we can't think about cost-based in the same way anymore. So factories might have left to get low-cost labor when it was a more labor-intensive technology or job like textiles or shoes or other kinds of basic consumer goods. But now it's very different. And I think that piece of it, how do we understand the changing nature of manufacturing production, means that the comparative advantages are defined somewhat differently. And I think it actually puts the US in a stronger position because you don't just have to worry about a big workforce, but you do need the skills, and we do need to find ways to do it quickly. And it kind of raises immigration issues. I mean, just for the semiconductor plants, a lot of the high-tech workers we've had coming in from India and China for years that have been part of our big high-tech companies are being caught as we get into a lot of immigration changes with regard to, do we need high-tech workers or low-tech workers? So it's complicated. That workforce piece is complicated. It's both training, but also perhaps bringing people in if you need to move faster.
You might say a word just about what it means for developing countries, because it's
Pardon?
you might say what it means for developing countries.
Well, and so I think developing countries that had relied on these kind of export industries are feeling that this is changing their position in these supply chains. But I think what's been happening in developing countries too is they are looking to other sources of comparative advantage. So Africa was a really good example of China doing lots of investment in Africa. And then some people would say, well, is Africa going to become the new source of low-cost labor? African countries did not have the size cities or size workforces or the skills you could find in other parts of the world like Bangladesh or Southeast Asia. But what Africa does have is natural resources. So the way developing countries are seeing this, they also see that value chain. And they're saying, how do we get into different industries, either through raw materials or through initial assembly work? And then how do we climb the value chain? And that's, I think, been some of the most interesting work that we've had to do. I just want to give one example. Kenya, for example, is the biggest exporter of cut flowers to Europe. All goes through Amsterdam. Cut flowers are far more valuable than not fresh flowers. But to do that, you have to create a refrigeration technology or a cold chain in country before they're shipped. So at one level, you'd say, well, that's great. Countries like Kenya can move up the value chain by doing that. But the technology for those cold chains was coming from European investors. So then they set up the cold chain in Kenya, or the same thing in Peru for grapes or a lot of fresh fruit and vegetables. That's a super important industry in terms of trade. So I think developing countries are trying to figure out where are they in the value chain, how can they improve their position, and how can they have some ownership of that? Because it's not just what technologies they need, but who owns them and how quickly you can do technology.
How to capture the value add. Anybody else have a question?
Yeah.
Hi, Bob Leese. I'm partner in crime with this guy here. Prior to coming to the ILI program, I had the pleasure of running Tyson Food Supply Chain through the pandemic. So I'm familiar with some of those things. Most of what you spoke about, I would term as sourcing risk, right? The ability to get product or to be able to supply your own product, whatever it be, right? Who would think that a mesh would be one of our biggest issues? My experience is, though, like if you were to, build a semiconductor plant in the United States, overall, over the course of 3 or 4 years, total global capacity would come to some new stable state. What sorts of work are you doing in terms of handling global capacity? And my experience during the pandemic was it was really, especially in the meat world, it was a capacity issue, right? You weren't going out to eat at a food service establishment, and so all of those grocery store issues happened, and the industry had stabilized at normal steady state, and it was a response in that set. And I could see managing that globally isn't a sourcing issue, right? It's a capacity issue. Does that make sense?
Yes. Two types of responses. One, I think on the capacity side, when you're looking at these semiconductor plants, is a good example. They're going to take 4 or 5 years to build, and they're tens of billions of dollars to put up. The concern is, how do we handle technological change? Because the way these cutting edge technologies are today in terms of semiconductors, if it's 3 nanometers, different companies are racing to make it 2 or 1, or to change the way that's being constructed. So the concern is, are we going to get a semiconductor glut? If you get all these factories that are being built coming online with what now are pretty close to cutting edge technologies, but 5 years from now might not be. And that's almost an argument back to the International Division of Labor. The US should try to do some of this, have other countries do other parts of this, and that would maybe smooth out the risk. And it's one other thing, when we did things like medical, the cost-based question, remember interviewing a lot of the US face mask manufacturers like 3M and others, and they said, the reason we went to China to begin with was because our biggest source of demand in the US was hospital systems. And hospital systems have notoriously tight budgets, and they're saying, go wherever you can to make the medical supplies you're making for us as cheap as possible, because that would free up money we can do for other things. So when you talk to the multinational manager who's looking at their clients in the US or other parts of the world, those cost issues aren't just make more profits or to just make things more cheap for a middle-class consumer, but it's often saying, we've got budget constrained clients and we're trying to do cost minimization for their purposes. So, yeah.
Gary,
Scott, how did he get in here?
well, you thought you left me by the side of the road in the middle of this arid desert, but I somehow got out. I will say, so thank you, Ray and Gary, for coming to Notre Dame and having getting Gary here. This really was good. I have a 2-part question.
Yeah.
But first of all, you did finally answer the question I've always had my entire life. Is it why did, when we were with the nomads going across the desert in Africa, you always were talking to them about supply chain management? Okay, I never understood until today, so thank you for clarifying that. So 2 questions or 2 points. You're here, you've gone through a great career in all of this. We have the Keough School and all of its different kind of divisions. That's kind of the new big kid on the block. Could you give us a little thoughts on where maybe you would suggest its direction should go in this big picture? The second question I have is many of the other countries out there, China as an example, is more of a command political structure, so they can get things done very quickly. How are we going to deal with it, given the chaotic and increasingly partisan nature of our internal politics and stuff? Are you optimistic about this? How do you see us working our way through that?
Great big questions. I think the Keough School question is a great university question, in the sense that when I went to Duke in the 80s and the 90s, most universities were growing global programs around regional studies programs. So when I went to Duke, they had a strong Latin America program, they had a strong Europe program. Later, they added Asia and other things. And Title VI money, which was providing ways to learn languages, fed into universities very well. By the early 2000s, all of these area programs were being challenged because the key issues that were coming up were actually cross-regional or global. So when I had finished that work on Mexico, and I did a book on Mexico's pharmaceutical industry. My next book with colleagues was called Manufacturing Miracles, and it focused on Mexico, Brazil, South Korea, Taiwan. So for people who sort of saw me as a Latin Americanist, they're saying, wait, what's going on? Why are you doing Latin America and Asia? And I think the way research has been pushed because of the way the world is evolving, you have to do, initially we had to use regional stepping stones to become global, but now the most important questions that are coming out are cross-cutting regions. So that's why I think a school like Keough School here and other kinds of public policy programs are having to take this global cross-regional perspective, which leaves some of the regional programs in a different position. And if I think even from journals, the top journals like Latin American Research Review, they're not getting the best articles anymore because the best Latin Americanists are also working on other regions of the world. So I think that's the reality. And if we need to think globally to connect, but we also need the knowledge base that comes out of the regional specialization. So I think Keough's well positioned to help identify these global issues and perhaps create research around those. I think the China question is super important. I tend to be an optimist, hopeful more maybe than an optimist, in the sense that I think China recognizes, as the US does, that it needs to be a competitor and not a rival of the US, because one advantage the US has is we have a tremendous network of allies and partners, both economically, but also militarily, et cetera. So when we're trying to develop these new industries and new technologies, we're pulling in investment from all of these parts of the world, and we've got our firms in these parts of the world. So we kind of have an international technology network that is as global as it needs to be. China, on the other hand, their great ascent was because they became an export power, and that was really facilitated after 2001 when they joined the World Trade Organization, and they exported even more. But when 2007-8 came, it hit China and other Asian export countries, the four tigers or dragons like Korea, Taiwan, and even places like Mexico that were pushing exports. It hit them really hard because that export-oriented industrialization model that was pushed by the World Bank and International Monetary Fund in the 80s and 90s and kind of was dubbed the Washington Consensus. This is the way countries can grow. When it hit the global recession, it meant that wasn't going to work anymore. I think what China started to do, and it was really has been accentuated in the last 10 plus years under President Xi from 2012 on, is China started to turn inward. China said, okay, we can continue to export, but even when they were exporting, they were very consciously moving from lower tech goods to mid-tech goods to high-tech goods. And the low-tech products like shoes and clothes, they were moving it from the coastal provinces to the interior provinces, and then later to Vietnam and Cambodia and other places, because they wanted to focus on the mid-tech and high-tech and these technologies of the future. So China never saw itself in what other people called a race to the bottom. You're just there because you've got low-cost labor. China wanted to see itself in a race to the top. They wanted to go up the technology ladder. Well, now they've done a lot of that. But once they're being perceived as a global superpower, now they are facing a lot more opposition from other countries that are concerned about the security risks and the military issues that are coming. So I think China's leadership is in a very critical juncture. They've got big demographic problems like other parts of the world. They've got to try to figure out how do they continue to have allies from different regions. Their Belt and Road Initiative is important for Africa, Central Asia. So I think that in the end, China and the US can establish a kind of healthy, strong, competitive relationship. To me, the thing I think the US, I sort of worry about on the US side is we have had such a strong flow of high-tech, not even workers, let's say, coming from India, China, and elsewhere into the US educational system. When I look at Duke University, and my good friend who's the head of the physics department, they would tell me for 20 years, 80% of our physicists are international. So the US is a magnet. We can get the best talent in the world. They can be trained in the US universities. There's really no parallel for US universities elsewhere. Our question is what happens once they graduate? And before they used to go into high-tech US-based companies, we've done studies that the top, whatever, 20 tech companies, over 50% of their patents come from foreign-born workers, but who are US-based and resident. So I think that's an issue the US needs to grapple with, and other countries who see this are thinking about from the other side, India or China, or don't want their top talent leaving their countries. So I think we're back to changing the dynamics from cost-based to there's a resource challenge. So the resource issues are there, but it's the skills challenge that I think, how do we create the best, smartest people that can deal with these new issues? And there's a technological side of it that we can see in things like artificial intelligence. But in some of our earlier discussions, people were saying, well, supply chain management used to be seen as kind of a business problem, logistics and cost flows, and how do you get goods from point A to point B to point C as fast as possible? Now, I think supply chain management requires much more creative, internationally oriented thinking. And just one example, we did a project. I've spent a semester in Denmark, in Copenhagen, and Maersk, one of the biggest shipping line, they commissioned studies, and they said, we're worried about how technology change is affecting the products that we're shipping around the world. And we're also worried that companies are going to be looking for us to do more on the knowledge side, not just move goods around, but build ports in certain countries. But who's going to do the last mile consulting? When goods get to country A or B, is that going to be us, or is it going to be the consulting firm? So the top companies in the world, when they think about their business models are being challenged. And so again, it comes back to universities. How can universities help think through these supply chain issues in much more complex ways than just transport and cost? And of course, we've had huge technology changes in those areas, the size of ships, the speed, but that's not the intangible issues are now the most important ones. They're now more knowledge-based and sort of geopolitical configurations of industry. So I think those are the problems that big companies are thinking about in the US and elsewhere. And we really need multidisciplinary, globally oriented university folks to be helping think through that and to create a space where these conversations can be had.
Anybody else? Yeah.
So thank you both. This is a very fascinating event, so I really appreciate it. Address a number of very, very important issues. I'm Greg Robson. I'm a philosopher teaching in the business school here. I had a question about how to think well about supply chain and specifically their scope. So whether they should be more globalized or regional or national and so forth. So it strikes me that the information requirements, hopefully this is on. Good. So the information requirements for thinking well about the supply chains are extremely high. So as a sociologist, you well know that human societies might be the most complex entities in the known universe. We're talking about supply chains that span countries and continents and involve hundreds of millions of people. And so it seems like we want to get a sense of the option set for different kinds of supply chains of different scopes. And in principle, there are many different ways in which supply chains can be configured, many different forms they can take. So my question is, how can we be confident, or at least moderately confident, that we have a good sense of whether supply chains should be more globalized in general, or even in a given case, or there should be more reshoring, they should be more domestic, and so forth? It strikes me as an exciting challenge, a big challenge, but an exciting challenge as far as trying to get a sense of how to arrange the information required to think well about these questions.
Yep, thank you for that. Two quick answers. One way would be, if you look at particular industries that have supply chain challenges, whether it's critical minerals or semiconductors, my first step would be to look at how a set of key companies in that industry are dealing with that question. Because I've found, and it surprised me always, that leading companies in an industry often have very different business models, and they can be equally successful. So in a sense, it's not like there is one right answer to that question, but to implement different approaches, you'd want to sort of see how that works out in practice. So I think that's step one. There isn't just one answer, but if there's going to be more than one, how do we understand how it's being done by looking at actual cases, best practice, let's call it. And the other part of the answer is when we think about these supply chain issues linked to development from the bottom up, not just from the top down with the firms, the research everybody's been doing in this field is saying you've got to take the economic considerations and link them to social considerations and link them to environmental. You can take any one of those and try to focus on how to make improvements, but the companies realize that you can't just have a cost-based solution where you've got labor problems or labor issues here, and countries are also trying to build up their capabilities. And I think the environmental ones are really creating the big sustainability challenges, because now with climate change, that's throwing some additional variables. So I think this idea of how do we link and answering those questions, economic plus social plus environmental plus X, whatever the next thing we're worried about, it requires multi-dimensional answers. But I would look to companies who are grappling with this and seeing how are they figuring this out and what's current best practice, and then think maybe what some options may be for other companies or countries that are trying to come into that space.
And we have time for one more question.
Yes, Carl Brown, the president of a global manufacturing company based here in Indiana. You've hit on it a little bit, but the shift to electrification and the great consumption of lithium that's coming, how do you see that shifting the balance of power between those countries that have been traditionally rich in fossil fuel supply, and where is those shifts of balance of power is going to, either for production and then refining?
Okay, big issues. I'm sure you know much more about them than me, but the things that two observations that I've seen, when we called things rare earth minerals and we said their location is restricted, that was a kind of a comparative advantage assessment. When lithium and cobalt and all these other key minerals have started to be identified as really important, other countries have started to invest more in discovering whether or not they have deposits. So places like Australia and Canada and Peru and other places, so we've been discovering maybe greater availability of some of these materials. But to me, the key question is not just where they are getting them out of the ground, but how are they being processed? I mean, that's been the big bottleneck for the US. We have coal mines in New Mexico, for example, but almost all the processing of these materials is being done in Asia, China and India and elsewhere, partly because the environmental cost of that processing are still very high, and the US, with its higher environmental requirements, hasn't been wanting to do that. Now, I just think there's an opportunity here, which is, and we said the same problems rising with coal. Even fossil-based fuels could be done more cleanly, but to create new clean technology for coal or for lithium processing or whatever is an enormous investment. Who's going to undertake that investment? So for the moment, I think our workaround has been find more sources of products like lithium, try to work with countries that would share many of your values. So I think Canada is an extremely important partner of the US in this, because Canada would have a lot of the same concerns and relatively lower transport costs. And then see if tackling the clean processing issue could provide maybe an opportunity for some US or other companies, because if you could do it in a clean way, there would be global demand for that. But I think since everybody's trying to move so fast to get these products for the new batteries that are coming out, we've continued to kind of bypass the processing stage, but I think that's been a bottleneck, and where the new technology development might come from there. And finally, as problems emerge around finding things like cobalt, when we had problems in Congo and other places where it was, companies also then try to innovate around it. They try to replace the raw materials. I learned that when I was doing my work in Mexico on the pharmaceutical industry, that there was a plant that was abundant in Mexico. They were processing it, but the Mexican government wanted to put controls. So the pharmaceutical companies say, how can we come up with a synthetic way to produce the same product? So the danger you always have as a raw material supplier is you can, technology can bypass you. And that happened with copper. For example, when Chile was the #1 copper exporter and Peru right behind them, when we had glass filament cables come along, that took away 70% of the world demand for bulk copper. So I think that's something that developing the sources of these raw materials would have in the back of the mind. Is technology going to bypass the need for these products? But I think with something like lithium, we see it, but it's a processing bottleneck as far as I can tell. But I'd love to get your impressions later on these
Great.
issues.
We're right at the time we promised that we would let you all go to lunch. Maybe I just offer a couple of sort of reflections as we close. You know, I don't think we could be at a more exciting time in the world to be actually thinking deeply about the future of business and the United States kind of positioning vis-a-vis business, and how important it is to have sort of a strategic perspective on that, and how important it is to be following the kind of bold new policies that are actually coming out of Washington right now, which I think are going to be, I don't think we really appreciate how transformative they're going to be to the nation over the next probably decade. But I think we're at a good moment. I think this return of industrial policy, getting the balance right, is going to be really important. But I think we're probably headed in the right direction. And I think maybe here at the university, I think the big takeaway, I think, from Gary's remarks are there's a lot of really important work that can be done by universities to complement what's being done by consulting firms and what's being done by entities inside companies that are charged with this kind of thinking. But I think the opportunity universities have, I think, is to really advance the research and provide the kind of safe space for the kind of stakeholder engagement that oftentimes isn't necessarily available to the business community, in the competitive spaces it actually often has to operate within. I hope you found this a rich discussion that really left you feeling challenged and informed about the direction we're going as a nation. And our hope here at the McKenna Center, the Keough School, is that we can provide more such opportunities for you all in the future. So I'd like maybe you could all join me in thanking Gary for a really stimulating hour and a half conversation.